What to do with the Nazi criminals? That was the question on the minds of the Allied leaders as World War II was heading towards victory for their side. Interestingly, the answer was found in the German city of Nuremberg. There, one of the most significant legal proceedings in history took place when 24 of the most powerful Nazi leaders were tried for the crimes committed by the Third Reich. The end of the conflict did not mean the end of the deaths, as 12 of these German leaders were sentenced to die by hanging. In this video, we will tell you what happened to the dozen condemned by the Nuremberg tribunal and the incredible and macabre fate of their corpses. Welcome to another installment of military history. With the surrender of Germany in early May 1945, there was joy around the world, but also a tremendous responsibility. What would happen to the most important war criminals of the Third Reich? Winston Churchill and his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, had a carefully planned strategy. They believed that as many leaders as possible should be detained and then subjected to a severe trial wherever they were found. The process had to be led by the highest military authority present, and the execution had to take place within 6 hours. For the British leader, the only way to move forward and deter future Nazi uprisings was the elimination of the remaining leaders, including collaborators who had held power. However, there was a surprising twist in the resolution, as Stalin and the Soviets strongly opposed this approach. They demanded trials be conducted where the crimes had been committed. This surprised everyone, but they eventually reached an agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom, organizing one of the most famous legal and political events in history, the Nuremberg trials of 1945. The tribunal, established in October of that year by representatives of the Allied powers, aimed to judge the involvement of a long list of Third Reich personalities in the crimes committed during the war. For a year, dozens of accused and witnesses passed through the Nuremberg courtroom, including 24 senior Nazi officers who were charged with 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity.
On the count of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging.
Contrary to what one might imagine, the Nazi leaders preferred to be executed immediately, as they did not want to go down in history in a shameful manner. The Allies did not grant their request for immediate execution but instead opted for a trial. Through the Nuremberg trials, which formally began on November 20, 1945, they wanted the world to understand that the response to barbarism and dehumanization was a fair legal process, not revenge. The convicted Nazis received different sentences, but 12 of them, the highest-ranking officials, were sentenced to death by hanging. They were Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe and Deputy Chancellor of the Führer, Hans Frank, former Governor-General of Poland, Wilhelm Frick, former Interior Minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alfred Jodl, former Commander of the Eastern Army, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, former commander of extermination camps, Alfred Rosenberg, philosopher and Nazi ideologue, Fritz Sokol, former director of the slave labor program, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, former director of the Reichsbank, Wilhelm Keitel, former commander of the German army, and Julius Streicher, former editor of the fanatical anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer. 2 of the condemned did not die by hanging. The first was Martin Bormann, head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, Hitler's secretary, and party leader, who was tried in absentia. For decades, it was believed that he had managed to escape, with some even claiming to have seen him in South America, or he was thought to be running a secret network. There were those who believed he had died in the fall of Berlin in those final days of the regime when Soviet soldiers entered. After much suspense, forensic studies of remains found at the site determined that Bormann had died in the German capital in 1945. In addition to Martin Bormann, the other leader who escaped the fate of hanging was Hermann Göring, Hitler's official successor after his death, who had asked to be shot to die with honor during the trial. He ultimately evaded his sentence by committing suicide the night before by biting into a cyanide pill. For years, it was unknown how he had obtained it until, nearly half a century later, an American soldier confessed that he had provided it, but he had been deceived. According to his account, one afternoon, as he was leaving the detention center, he was approached by a beautiful German girl and two men. They asked him to give the prisoner a supposed medicine that Göring needed to deal with his coronary problems. From the announcement of the sentences to the executions, 2 weeks passed, adding to the long 11 months of the trials. As expected, all the convicts appealed to have their death sentences revoked, or in case the sentences were upheld, to be executed by a firing squad, as hanging was considered a dishonorable death. On October 11, the court rejected the appeals and upheld the convictions, so the next day, the condemned could see their families for the last time. In the early hours of October 16, 1946, the sentences were carried out, and 10 of the Nazi leaders were hanged dishonorably. While Göring's lifeless body lay in the prison morgue, the other 10 condemned to death were hanged one after another in just 1 hour and 34 minutes. The location used was the prison gymnasium. At 1:11 in the morning, Ribbentrop was the first to be hanged. All were allowed to speak some last words, and the most common were patriotic references. For instance, the foreign minister firmly stated, "God protect Germany," and then added, "My last wish is that German unity endures, that an understanding is reached between the East and the West, and peace for the world." Others continued to proclaim their hatred of Jews until the last moment, as was the case with Julius Streicher, the anti-Semitic propagandist who shouted Heil Hitler as they led him upstairs. From the gallows, while they placed the rope around his neck, he declared loudly, "The Bolsheviks will hang all of you someday." Purimfest 1946, in reference to a Jewish holiday, as a mockery. The executioners of the Nazi leaders were Sergeant Major John C. Woods and his assistant, military police officer Joseph Malta. It was rumored at the time that Woods intentionally miscalculated the lengths of the ropes used for the executions so that some of the men did not die quickly from the intended neck fracture but were strangled slowly. Some reports from the time indicated that some executions took 14 to 28 minutes. The army denied claims that the drop length was too short or that the condemned died from strangulation instead of a neck fracture. Another curious detail is that the trapdoor was too small, so several of the condemned suffered sharp head injuries when they hit their heads during the fall. According to German law, the bodies were supposed to be returned to the families within 24 hours of the execution, but the Allies were concerned about an issue that troubled them. Authorities feared that the remains or the burial site of figures like Göring would become a Nazi cult site. This suspicion led them to dismiss the idea of handing over the remains to the families and instead do something entirely different, and in some cases, considered indecorous. It seemed that the karma of the atrocities committed by these Third Reich leaders was not finished with their execution. The bodies were photographed as protocol suggested. Then, they were stripped and placed in cheap wooden coffins. They were given false identities with the names of supposed American soldiers to conceal the plan that was underway. Under this guise, the remains were transported to the Ostfriedhof crematorium in Munich. Once there, and with extreme care since other soldiers' funerals were taking place, they were individually cremated and placed in carefully labeled urns with their fake names. After the bodies were incinerated, the urns were transferred to an American mortuary unit about 20 kilometers from where they had been cremated. At the site, the urns were destroyed, and their ashes were scattered into an undisclosed location in the Isar River. Their clothing and uniforms were incinerated, while their badges with gold, silver, or precious stones were preserved for the materials to be reused. Other highly symbolic decorations, such as the iron crosses characteristic of the Nazis, many of which were obtained through criminal actions, were condemned to oblivion. We are reaching the end of this installment, and we wanted to ask you, do you think the actions taken by the Allied authorities with the bodies of the condemned Nazi leaders were appropriate? Share your opinions in the comments below. That concludes today's video. Thank you for watching until the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the next installments of Military History.